Get the full Bonfire experience on your screen. YouTube.com/BonfireSports. Thumbs up, subscribe, you'll know when we're live. Enjoy the games. On the highway we are, Bonfire Sports. Darrin Bauming. Here is Ted Wyman, Jeff Hamilton, the two newspaper scribes covering your Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and we're just cruising down the highway here. We recently crossed the Saskatchewan border, and we thought, hey, let's throw up a little podcast on Bonfire Sports, talking a little ball. Fellas, excited for the weekend?
Oh, absolutely. Labor Day Classic's one of my favorite weekends of the entire year, and especially of the Canadian Football League season. I know probably been going 5 or 6 years now, and I mean, even as a reporter, not just going as a fan, it's always a great time. It's something to look forward to. It's sold out. It's a great atmosphere, and it's a great rivalry.
Look, I'm not trying to be harsh here, but Regina's a tough city to be in. It really is. It's a tough city to stay a long time. If you're gonna go,
real.
If you're gonna, I'm just saying, if you're gonna go to Regina, you better go Labor Day weekend, because it's the best. It's the best time to go to Regina. And you know what? Look at the weather this year. It's like 30 plus degrees. I mean, I know September long is usually okay for the most part. You know what I mean? Like May long is when we usually get rain. It's like almost a guarantee. But like the weather's awesome. It's a year removed from what I thought in 21 was, best way to describe it would be like a watered down Labor Day, right? I mean, the COVID was rampant. Yeah. People were worried about being in stadiums. Yeah. They didn't want to, you know what I mean? Like the atmosphere, although it was exciting, I mean, there was lots of green there, and there were certainly the people who went out. There's nothing against people who went out from Winnipeg, because there was blue representation, but just not nearly to the levels. And so this year it's back. Yeah. So that's the exciting part. I think I'm looking most forward to.
I think it's like a celebration, right? And not just, as you mentioned, not just this year, but it's a celebration because of the tradition that is the Labor Day Classic, and now the Banjo Bowl, the game, of course, Troy Westwood named. My question, and maybe I'm absolutely nuts for asking this, but because Labor Day and that annual pilgrimage west from Manitoba to Saskatchewan, Wayne's World, the entire weekend, the trip in, the trip back, is the game sort of like, not the afterthought, but maybe not the main event. It's kind of complementary to everything else.
It's kind of funny you say that, because I think in a lot of years, for Bomber fans, they were going out to go and have this great experience of Labor Day, but the game was almost never any fun because the Roughriders would always win, and sometimes, quite often, win big. I think the Riders are 37-19 all time in the Labor Day Classic, so it's still fairly rare for the Bombers to win, but they did win last year. And they are favored to win at this point this year, going in with a 10-1 record. I'm thinking it's probably a lot more fun for Bombers fans to come into a situation like that than it has been in some other years.
I think it says so much that the Bombers are 3.5-point favorites against a Roughriders team that suddenly won a game in Vancouver last week. Nathan Rourke-less BC Lions.
I'm going to address your first question first, though. You're right. The game is almost an afterthought, because you get fired up most days. I mean, you go out, you have a couple Pepsis, you stay up probably around midnight or so, right?
Yeah, just midnight.
Just around midnight. And then the game shows up and you're like, oh, there's a game. And that's the same, and it's nothing against the game. It's obviously the game's a great part of the weekend, but it's at the end of the weekend. It's kind of almost a wind down, because, everyone's kind of having a great time. But it's much like the Grey Cup in that way, right? Like the Grey Cup is all about the lead up. And then the game kind of happens.
And then the next morning,
and I know Bomber fans are like, okay, give me a break. There's, the Bombers have been the last 2 Grey Cups. It's been exciting. It's been, a big part of my life as far as sports, right?
Celebration for days after.
Well, absolutely. But at the same time, like it's just that much fun leading into it. And as we know, it's the opposite in the NFL, right? And Super Bowl weekend, it's kind of like almost elitist leading up to it, and then the game, it's all about the game. So I don't know, it's going to be awesome in that respect for sure. I mean,
so sorry for jumping the gun there, but the 3.5-point line, does it surprise you guys? Like where Sask is, where Winnipeg is? I understand, injuries and that sort of thing come into it, but like Cody Fajardo has been anything but solid this year consistently. Their offensive line is a bit of a mess. There's obviously all the turmoil in Riderville with Garrett, Marino, and the suspensions, and so much kind of BS floating around there. Meanwhile, Winnipeg is, screws are tight.
Yeah, I mean, you know that Mike O'Shea and the Blue Bombers don't put a lot of stock into the history of the Labor Day Classic, but the odds makers obviously do. I mean, this is a game that's historically been extremely successful for the Roughriders. It's on their home turf. It's the most important game of the year for these fans, unless you're talking about the playoffs. And it's a great time, and it's a full crowd, and that atmosphere, it plays into it somewhat. I mean, the Bombers have been getting amazing crowds this year, and the players certainly talk like they get a big boost out of that, and it looks like they do. So I don't think that's a crazy line at all, Darren. I mean, I think that maybe the Bombers could be favored by a little bit more, but I think when you take into the factors of the Riders being at home on Labor Day, full crowd, having won last week, like you said, and the Bombers, they squeaked one out last week. They lost the week before. So, I don't think it's a crazy line.
Well, and here's the other thing. So 58 games, or this will be the 58th edition. So in the previous 57 games, Saskatchewan has won 37. So they're a 37-20 record. And yes, the Bombers won last year, but that was the second time they had won in like 16 years. And so to your point, Teddy, I think the biggest thing here is the crowd. Because it's the first sold-out game in the CFL season. It's absolutely crazy for the CFL, for the whole league.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, next week will be the second, as the Banjo Bowl in Winnipeg has been sold out, right? Banjo Bowl, I mean, let's give some credit here to Winnipeg. Banjo Bowl was actually, I think, sold out before.
It was, yeah.
I think Hamilton sold out too.
Yeah, but I think, anyway, regardless. So, but it's the crowd. It's even though you obviously the Bombers have done well away from IG Field.
They've done great at Mosaic historically.
Well, they have. Oh, absolutely. But I mean, just in general, like, this is a noise that they are unused. They're not used to, and I mean, that was evident in practice all week, because they had artificial, crowd noise and getting ready for it. And the big thing is that communication on the offensive line is going to be very, very key, right? And we all know how dangerous the Roughriders D-line is, and when you combine those two things, that turns into a big obstacle. And anyone who knows anything about betting understands that the home team gets an automatic 3 points.
CFL,
so you take all those things in consideration as far as that, whatever. It's not overly surprising. The other thing about it too, if you're going to get in, I'll be Mr. Stats here, it's like more than 30 times of the 57 previous games, more than 30 times have gone down to the final 3 minutes. So it's going to be a close game. It's going to be a tough battle. I think in this situation, the Bombers are a bit banged up. But I think in this situation, I almost look at Winnipeg and I go, what an opportunity to, because it's so low.
What I've noticed this week is two things from the Blue Bombers fan base. Bomber Nation is anxious, and there's angst because of Garrett Marino. And it's interesting, Jeff, that you mentioned the D line and how good they are against this Blue Bombers offensive line that frankly hasn't looked as good as past seasons, especially the last 2 seasons. They play against Montreal, Mike Moore and all those guys putting tons of pressure on Zach Collaros. Calgary did a good job as well. Now you're going against arguably the best, if not right there, 1-2 defensive lines in the CFL. Pete Robertson, Anthony Lanier, Garrett Marino, and then of course AC Leonard. They're going to bring that pressure all day long, and Winnipeg, we don't even know if Michael Couture is going to be in the lineup, and we're watching Pat Neufeld and other guys take their vet days. It could be a long day on offense for Winnipeg. It could be a busy day for Liegghio punting.
Yeah, honestly, DB, if you really break it down, the Bombers have lost 1 game this year, and to me, the number one reason they lost that 1 game is because the offensive line couldn't handle what the Montreal Alouettes were bringing. They got to Zach Collaros a bunch. They hit him a bunch. They forced picks. They forced a huge fumble that really cost the Bombers the game. And, that made such a big difference in that game. And I thought even the week before, the Bombers had a lot of trouble containing what Montreal was bringing. And, the Roughriders have a better defensive line than Montreal, in my opinion. At least it's been more effective to this point. The Bombers really have to be game planning for that. And, Buck Pierce said just as much yesterday when Jeff asked him about it. They acknowledge that it all starts there, and that they have to take care of that defensive line. And you threw out the name Garrett Marino. There's a wild card in all of this because that guy can cause so much trouble. There was already bad blood with him with the Bombers last year in the Banjo Bowl, and obviously he's caused a lot of trouble this year in the CFL and been suspended for it. The Bombers obviously and their fans very much hoping that this Rough Rider defensive line doesn't injure another quarterback because they've already knocked out 3 this year.
Well, and I was going to pick up where you just ended, is that and 2 of those 3 injuries, and those 3 injuries being obviously Garrett Marino's, let's call it what it is, bullshit move against Jeremiah Masoli in Week 5 against the Ottawa Redblacks.
Brutal.
He's been out for several weeks now.
Season's over.
I don't think, is it officially over? I think I read it was a 10 to 12 week, but
it's
I mean,
it's a one-win team.
Hey, that's assuming the Ottawa Redblacks are going to make the playoffs, so we'll call it over, right? But it absolutely derailed their season, all right? Yeah. But the last 2 of those 3 have come in the last 2 weeks. Now, Pete Robertson is not a cheap player. He got to Rourke, but he got injured, right? And then Michael O'Connor last week, right, when suffering a groin injury. So it's not even like, I don't want to dub these guys quarterback killers. It's a little hyperbolic.
Darnell Sankey absolutely stapling Michael O'Connor to the turf.
And so I think it's a real concern, given what we saw against Montreal and a bit of a leaky O-line, given some of the injuries and maybe whatever. So given some of the, I think Montreal was a bit of a different beast. I think they were under new coaching, so the film wasn't the same. Noel Thorpe took over, obviously, and so I do think it's a bit of a different beast. I think the Riders have been consistent all season, so the tape will reflect that. But at the same time, they've just been that good. Like they will rush 7, they'll rush 6, they'll rush 5. They get pressure on the quarterback rushing 4, and in some cases, guys, 3. So when you're able to do that, it opens up so much more for your defense. To be preventative in the secondary, especially if you're getting to the quarterback early. The good news is, Zach Collaros can run. He can extend plays. He's not afraid to do those things, and he's been doing it since he joined the Bombers in 2019. So obviously it's always a top priority to keep your QB on his feet. It's particularly important one when you're facing this line with a unit that has a guy like Garrett Marino.
And there's a lot of importance on Brady Oliveira as well, and in more than one way. Obviously,
gotta keep it going.
If they can keep him running the football as well as he has been the last few weeks, then you're mixing it up enough to make it difficult for that defensive line. But also, he's got to pick up blocks, and from what all we've been hearing, he's been doing a really good job with that. Very much along the lines of the kind of production that Andrew Harris provided for the Bombers for a long time. Not calling them the same players, but his numbers in the last few weeks and the things that he's been doing in the game, catching the football out of the backfield and picking up his blocks, running the ball well. That's what Andrew Harris did for the Bombers, and that's a huge part of why the Bombers have been successful lately.
When people talk about the best players in the CFL, they'll go through the quarterbacks, right? This year, Zach Collaros, Nathan Rourke. They'll talk about receivers like Geno Lewis and Kenny Lawler, Kadeem Carey running the football, William Stanback. They'll talk about Adam Bighill, Willie Jefferson, Jagarrett Davis. But one player that I think doesn't get enough attention when it comes to that conversation of like top 5 players in the league is Derek Moncrief. This guy can do a little bit of everything, and he does under defensive coordinator Jason Shivers and this Riders defense. He is big, he is strong, he is fast, he can cover, he can rush the quarterback. I think, the D-line is a real strength of Saskatchewan, but I think it's a strength too because right behind them, at the dime back and sometimes other spots, Derek Moncrief's there making plays.
He's one of the more interesting dime backs out there because he's really a true linebacker who also can cover, right? And that's something that a lot of teams don't use in that position. They use a guy who's a little bit more like a defensive back all the way. I think the Bombers have a guy like that in Donald Rutledge as well. He's a bigger guy, and he's obviously a good tackler and a good cover man. But I think Moncrief has shown over the years that he's a real impact player from that spot. And of course, they've got a really good linebacking core all around. Let's just face it, the Riders have a good defense, and this Bomber offense is going to be hard-pressed to put up the numbers that they have in some previous weeks. So, it's going to be really important for the Blue Bomber defense to hold Cody Fajardo and that Saskatchewan offense in check.
Let's talk more about that Sask defense, Bombers defense versus the Riders offense. Do you guys see as Cody Fajardo as the X factor? We've seen Jamal Morrow, their tailback, play exceptional this season. Now injured, Frankie Hickson steps in, looks just as dangerous, if not more. But it's that interior of the offensive line. A lot has been said about them and their inability to, run the football, pass protect, do the things they need to do to have an effective offense under Jason Moss. But do you see Cody as the X factor?
I see the O-line as the X factor. I mean, it's hard to ignore the fact that Cody Fajardo is the most important player on the Riders, obviously. But if you look at last week's game, even though they won by a touchdown, Fajardo was sacked 7 times.
Yeah.
So that and as much as we talk about
big number.
Well, as much as we talk about this Riders defensive line that leads the league in sacks, they also lead the league in sacks allowed. So we talk about the battle of the trenches, and that ultimately defines a game, or
especially rivalry games like this.
Well,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. And so as much as this the game will be as much as the game will depend on how Cody Fajardo plays, I think the way Cody Fajardo plays depends on how much protection he gets. This guy isn't the mobile quarterback that he was in 2019. He's not extending massive plays. Like now he does have he is a gutsy player. He will run the ball when he has to, but this guy's had a knee injury that he's been working through all season long. So and we're not in week 2 or 3. We're in week 13. So this guy he's banged up. So I certainly think that obviously Fajardo's it's gonna make or break with him. I don't think that the Rough Riders defense is gonna necessarily completely dictate the game, but at the same time I just think that O-line is suspect, and it's been the Achilles heel of this team since the beginning of the year.
It's going to be interesting to see about the Bombers on defense, Darren, because there are some injuries there, and it certainly looks like Malik Clements is going to be out on the at the weak side linebacker spot.
Big changes.
And Demario Houston is out. He was injured in the last game, and that means rookie Jamal Parker is going in at the field side cornerback. Winston Rose, as he did last game, moving over back to the boundary side, which he's done before, but that's still a change. And realistically, at that linebacker position, that's where it's the most up in the air, because Clements is out, and Adam Bighill has been limited all week. So you've seen the Bombers using mostly Shane Gauthier and Jesse Briggs, 2 longtime veteran Bombers, 2 Canadian guys who we know can play the positions, but without usually Bighill's alongside of one of them when they're doing it. If he's not in there, and I'm not saying that he's not going to be playing, but we just don't know at this point, and that could be a real change. But even if Bighill is playing, you're already missing Kyrie Wilson at weak side linebacker. Now you're missing Malik Clements at weak side linebacker. You're really digging deep into the 3rd level, and it'll be really interesting to see how much that side of the field gets attacked, because you're going to be looking at the weak side linebacker being new and the field side corner being new.
All I'm saying is, if Winnipeg wants to find success on defense in the Labor Day Classic, they're going to have to do it with their defensive line. If there's question marks at linebacker, question marks in the defensive secondary, I don't know if they're getting the level of play they really want at safety. Jamal Parker, against Calgary last week, after Demario Houston went down, Winnipeg played very soft, kept everything in front of them, and Jake Mayer went to work, right? He started, slicing and dicing them up. Sask's offense doesn't really play that style. They like to go for the deep shot. Keenan Schaefer-Baker, Duke Williams, Kieran Moore. I think if Saskatchewan is able to protect Cody and let him get set and throw, I know that knee injury hasn't affected just his running ability, it's also affected his deep ball ability, because he just can't plant and throw the football as well. That if they can protect Cody, I think Winnipeg might be in some trouble, because it could be a bit of an air raid against the Bombers.
Yeah, and maybe the Bombers' defensive line needs to step it up a little bit more than they have all season. I mean, we just haven't seen the big numbers in terms of sacks from Willie Jefferson and Jackson Jeffcoat, and almost as many coming from the interior of the line as we've seen from the rush end. So you'd think this would be a good time for them to step up. As Jeff mentioned, 7 sacks against last week, and that was not against Jackson Jeffcoat and Willie Jefferson. But if those 2 guys, I'm not even saying they haven't played their best, they certainly still are effective, and they still wreak a lot of havoc back there. But it's about time to really have one of those games where you say the defensive line made the difference.
special teams is that X factor. You know, we've talked about the offense versus the defense both ways. I think Marc Liegghio is punting extremely well.
Agreed.
But I got to ask you guys what you think of his place kicking, not just over the last couple weeks, obviously the 2 big misses against Montreal, but all season. From a very young player that's really just in his second year of pro football and handling all 3 duties.
We've definitely been hard on Marc Liegghio at times. You know, this season I think it's tough to fill the shoes of a guy like Justin Medlock, and as we saw last season, he ended up losing his job. Then Ali Murtado came in. He ended up losing his job, and then obviously signing Sergio Castillo ahead of the Grey Cup run.
Monster in the cup.
So so when they went back to Liegghio this season, it wasn't necessarily an eyebrow raiser, because yes, last season was his first year, essentially, right? He was still learning. It's a big transition. As much as the kicks may seem the same, it's a big transition to go from college
playing in front of 1,500 people to 15,000 plus.
Totally, and the stakes are greater, and the kicking game has a bigger impact than in Canadian college football a lot of the times, right? I mean, there's such a small margin for error in a lot of these games, right? Particularly in the playoffs, and so and it's just that it's so fascinating to me, this the whole Liegghio situation, and giving him both jobs last year and then giving him back this year, because this is a team that paid through the roof for Justin Medlock, because they knew exactly what, like Justin Medlock, they trot him out for a 57-yarder. They trot him out for a 56, 55-yarder routinely, right? And more often than not, he'd make it. Rene Paredes can't even do that. I couldn't even believe that Rene Paredes' career long prior to this season was 52 yards in a game. So it just tells you how valuable. Anyway, back to Marc Liegghio. It's like he actually had decent stats. He has better stats, field goal kicking percentage, than Sergio Castillo this year, but he's protected. Like, if the Bombers have a 53-yarder, 52-yarder, they don't bring him out. They have brought him out in the past, but more often than not, they won't put him in that position. They'll take the field position over the risk of missing, and that, which tells me a lack of trust. And I mean, obviously, when things went off the rails in that game against Montreal, the lone loss, where you not only miss, a last second would have been a game-winning field goal, and then you hit the upright, in order. So to me, and I've been saying this for ever since then, really, is that I don't know what Marc Liegghio can do from now till the playoffs to prove that he can handle the emotions between the ears and all that stuff. And I know that might sound like a harsh thing, but the reality is if you don't have Sergio Castillo nailing field goals, guess what? The Bombers aren't back-to-back champs, and they certainly won't be three-peats if they can't trust their kicker can't come through.
Well, the only thing that would work for me, Jeff, would be if he could have, say, 3 pretty big kicks in 3 different games.
Right.
Not necessarily all for the win, but in the fourth quarter where they mean something, and make them all. Because that attempt for the win against Montreal looked like somebody who just did not have the mental space at that moment for that, for making the kick in that situation. His kick in overtime was better, but it still hit the upright and was no good. It just screamed of a guy who's not quite ready for prime time in those situations. And I mean, as Jeff said, I mean, it would have been automatic with Justin Medlock, and of course that's well in the past and long forgotten. He's not ever coming back. You have to move on. And for Mike O'Shea, this is a balance. He has to look at it as a situation where I think Marc Liegghio can be a good kicker. If I don't stick with him here, he probably has very little chance of being a good kicker. You got to let him work through it, and they're letting him do it. Yeah. He did make his kicks last week, but not in the same kind of pressure situations. You got to see him do it in a few pressure situations, or else I would have zero confidence going into the playoffs.
It's a show me business. It's a what have you done for me lately business, right? Here's the thing. When I hear Mike O'Shea talking about Marc Liegghio, I believe him when they say that they believe in him. I believe Mike O'Shea when they say Marc Liegghio has done it before, and that he has the talent, and he has the power, and he has the accuracy. I think he has all those physical tools. But as you mentioned, Ted, that's the first thing that went through my head when I was thinking about those 2 kicks against Montreal. He misstruck that potential game-winning kick so bad. No doubt
chance.
he was thinking about that when he doinked it off the upright in overtime. So I had the pleasure of watching dozens of Blue Bomber games and CFL games with Troy Westwood. And, you know, he knows what it takes for better or for worse in pro football. And he says it plainly. Mentally, when it comes to kicking, it's 95% mental. And then Troy would also add, maybe even more. So when do you find out the mettle of a young man like Marc Liegghio? We've seen it in games that don't matter. We've seen them go out and make a trade for a veteran guy going into games that did matter last season. What's going to happen this year if Marc Liegghio, as you said, you know, doesn't show that he can get the job done when it counts?
Well, it's pretty obvious that if he does miss again, maybe I'm wrong, I think it's pretty obvious. If he were to miss in a key situation again, I don't think there'd be any choice but to go out and try to get someone else.
Well, how many teams have a kicker on their practice roster?
I have no idea.
I'm pretty sure it's one, and it's the Blue Bombers.
Well, and that's it. They're not going to find a new kicker. If they're switching legs, they're going to Ali Murtada.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
you know, unless like a Liam Palalahu comes into play, and
Right.
you know, and they can get
Okay.
somebody with a decent, but they're going to go to him. And then and if that doesn't work out, then they'll do what they did. I mean, it's not as easy, right? Like I'm under the impression, I get the feeling at the very least, that there's not a lot of teams that want to help out the Winnipeg Blue Bombers.
Right.
And I think
But
the BC Lions looked like the BC Lions
Edmonton's
ultimately
the question to me.
helped out the Bombers last year, right?
Yes,
Like
they
he
did.
was on their rights, but he wasn't on their, you know, and he's like, yeah, take him. And what does he do? He's the, you know, he wasn't quite the Grey Cup MVP.
But he
We don't have to
could
get
have
into that, but he should have.
I voted for him.
Should have been. I didn't vote. I was the tie-in vote, just for the record, so there was no tie. But so I think that's the process. I just, you know, I think, you know, and when I said earlier that I don't know what Marc Liegghio could do, well, if Marc Liegghio comes out and he's perfect the rest of the season, there's absolutely no reason to go get a kicker. But it's just like, you know, we look at his season, and we look at that game against Montreal, and then we look at his, like, heading into that game, we look at his statistics, 18 out of 20. Well, that's pretty damn good for a kicker, right? He misses 2, things happen. We've seen it all. We've seen it on every team. It doesn't matter if you're Rennie Paredes, Justin Mellor, whatever. We've seen it happen for every team. So you're gonna miss every once in a while. But what we never really talked about was he kept on missing 1-point converts that left the Bombers in a weird, you know, in a bad situation late in the game, only to be bailed out by the defense.
Mm-hmm.
And my point is, that's one thing to do that in the regular season. To leave that up to chance in the playoffs, where it's win or go home, I don't know if that's something that Mike O'Shea can stomach. I just don't think it is. Mike will step in front of reporters. He'll tell us and everybody who wants to listen or ask that he's got the utmost trust. But that's what he's going to say 100 times out of 100 times.
Because that's what he's going to say to Mark's face.
Right, and he said that leading into signing Sergio Castillo. Like,
Yes.
nobody, you know, no one was like, you got to get it, you know what I mean? Like, don't get me wrong, media was, but Mike wasn't saying, oh, we're looking, you know what I mean?
Right.
It was, we trust this guy, this is our guy, you know, they put the work in and blah, 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 and then boom. So,
and let's be clear here too, because I think a lot of people don't understand those inner workings of football teams. It's not just the Bombers, all of them. But it's not Mike O'Shea says one thing and then Kyle Walters goes and signs somebody and be like, oh, Mike, I got you a kicker. They all talk and ensure that they have what they need. The OC, the DC, the assistants, the head coach, the GM, the scouts, the assistant GM. They're all in constant communication with one another talking about the roster. So it's not like Mike O'Shea said, I have faith in Marc Liegghio, and then suddenly Kyle Walters pulls a trade. They knew it was coming. Here's my question. Chris Jones is making trades in Edmonton right now like he is a teenager with NHL 94. Could Sergio Castillo join the Blue Bombers for the playoffs? Because Edmonton really right now looks like they're packing it in.
Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong. Castillo's under contract for next season? I believe he is. And I think that's the factor that makes this
That
more
Edmonton would want to
interesting.
keep him.
Yeah, because if he's not, if he weren't under contract for next season, then maybe, you know, for sure. Why wouldn't you trade him? And
Winnipeg
could
could just
sign him back. But if there's some kind of arrangement made, there's a possibility there.
I feel like we should know that. I don't know. It probably is 2 years. Even if it wasn't 2 years, I'm a little skeptical that Sergio Castillo would come here, based on how much does he love Edmonton, man. Think about it. Like, we went down to cover the game in Edmonton.
Maria's Northern Mexican cuisine.
It's the closest thing that he's had to food back home. You could just see this. Let's face it, we saw a different Sergio Castillo. Now, he wasn't a quiet, introverted guy necessarily with the Bombers, and granted, he did come later in the season, but, like, this guy is completely out of his shell. He feels at home with the Elks, and I just always thought that, you know, it might be one of those things, like, if he was on a 1-year deal and they're not going to make the playoffs, and from what I understand, talking to people in Edmonton, it's a miserable place to be. I think it's pretty normal when you got, you know, several guys coming in and out of the lineup. Like, I was joking about this the other day. Like, you know, Mike O'Shea tells people, like, look at the guy to your right, look at the guy to your left. That's who you're going to battle for. Like, Chris Jones can say, look at the guy to your left, look at the guy to your right. One of these guys is not going to be here next week. You know what I mean? Like, and that's just a rough situation for anybody.
Well,
particularly for people who have been in good, but even particularly for people who have been in good locker rooms that know what it takes. So I could see maybe if it was like a 1-year deal, if it was the only year that he'll come with the you know, go on the run, get a Grey Cup, you know, whatever, or fight for a Grey Cup at the very least, and then go back to Edmonton. But if he's on a 2-year deal, I don't know.
He is on a 2-year deal. I just looked it up. Just enough cell service here in rural Saskatchewan.
About an hour out of Regina.
Yeah, now we're east of Regina as we head our way in. This has been fun, guys. Maybe get your final thoughts from you. We're recording this on Friday. We're going to enjoy tonight. Walk through for both teams tomorrow. Nice media dinner as the rest of the city froths up ahead of the Labor Day Classic on Sunday, and then our pilgrimage home on Monday. I'll maybe plug Jeff's Instagram at Jeff K. Hamilton. Is that right?
At Jeff K. Hamilton, yeah.
So same as your Twitter.
Dummies are doing it.
Yeah.
We might not be as fresh on Monday.
Might not be as fresh on Monday, but no, this is a fun little pod to put up, a little bonus content on Bonfire Sports. If you're listening to the pod right now, or maybe I'll post this on YouTube, be sure to keep things locked. We got GameDay Winnipeg with Chris Walby on Saturday. We'll do a post-game as we always do, myself and Zach Schnitzer, after dark, after the Labor Day Classic. Ted, Jeff, where can everybody find your work, and what are you working on this weekend?
I was going to cover the game myself this Sunday. I don't know. Hopefully I make it.
I'm working on my alcohol tolerance.
That was sort of what I was getting at. But anyways, you know what? Obviously looking to, again, like I said at the start of this, it's just one of the best weekends of the year in the CFL, and you're just looking to capture what it's all about, right? I mean, it's Bomber fans who are traveling there. It's Rider fans from all over the province who are coming to just bask in the glory of the CFL. It's a highlight of the season for the entire league. Looks like it's going to be absolutely beautiful. Maybe a little bit hot for football, but pretty darn good on this Labor Day weekend. And to me, this is a very interesting game in terms of the standings too, because if the Bombers win, or they win 2 out of 3, they play the Riders 3 times this month, that's first place for Winnipeg all day long. And then the Roughriders are basically scrambling to try to get into the 4th place and the crossover.
You heard it here first. Ted isn't riding this weekend, so for the Winnipeg Sun.
I'm only driving.
Find all his stuff in the Winnipeg Sun, but no, I mean, this will be a special weekend. I love people watching. I'm looking forward to it being back to the event that we've all come to know it to be, and certainly been writing all week about the rivalry and talking about things like the D-line and should the Bombers be worried about Garrett, Marino, and I'll have my 5 storylines heading into the game tomorrow, today online, but Saturday's paper, and looking forward to covering both teams tomorrow. It's always a cool day, the Saturday, because you know how important it is to both sides, you know how important it is to both fan bases, and there's so many storylines that go into it. It's just it's the Labor Day Classic, and it certainly lives up to its reputation. So WinnipegFreePress.com are the pages of the
And I guess I should say WinnipegSun.com. I kind of forgot that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this game too. It's always a special one. Anytime I'm able to get out on the road with you guys and travel with the media, it's great. We got a lot of good friends in Regina, good friends from Winnipeg coming along as well. And well, hey, a football game in front of a sold-out crowd and a rivalry to boot, it's going to be a heck of a lot of fun on Sunday. But Ted, Jeff, appreciate you guys a lot. Thanks for this. Hey, be sure to check them out in the Winnipeg Sun, the Winnipeg Free Press, and we will see you a little bit later here on Bonfire Sports.